Ladies and gentlemen, Vito Genovese was born on November 27, 1897, in the small town of Tofino, nestled in the province of Naples, Italy. Growing up in the poverty-stricken south of Italy, Genovese witnessed hardship from an early age. The rural communities were struggling with economic instability, political unrest, and a widening gap between the wealthy elite and the working poor. In such an environment, survival often depended on cunning, strength, and the willingness to bend or break the rules. These early lessons would leave a lasting imprint on the boy who would later become one of the most feared figures in American organized crime. In 1913, when Vito was just 15 years old, his family made a bold decision to emigrate to the United States, part of a larger wave of Italian immigrants seeking better opportunities in the land of promise. They settled in Manhattan's Lower East Side, a chaotic, densely populated melting pot of immigrants where cultures clashed, poverty ran deep, and the rule of law often took a backseat to street justice. The neighborhood was harsh, but it offered a unique education for young Vito. Here, he was introduced to the shadow world of Italian street gangs and the early formations of what would later become the American Mafia. He quickly learned that survival in this new world meant more than hard work. It required influence, intimidation, and loyalty to the right people. It wasn't long before Genovese began associating with known criminals and started running errands for local gangsters, soaking up the street knowledge that would eventually propel him into the upper echelons of organized crime. By his late teens, Vito Genovese was no longer just another immigrant kid trying to get by. He was already carving out a reputation as someone to be watched, someone willing to do whatever it took to rise above his station in life. As Vito Genovese grew into adulthood in the gritty streets of New York City, he fully immersed himself in the world of organized crime. The Prohibition era, which began in 1920, created a perfect storm for ambitious young gangsters like Genovese. With alcohol banned across the United States, an enormous black market emerged overnight. The Mafia seized the opportunity, and Vito saw this as his ticket to real power. He quickly aligned himself with Giuseppe "Joe the Boss" Masuria, one of the most powerful and feared Mafia leaders in the city at the time. Under Masuria's wing, Genovese proved himself as a reliable enforcer, cold, calculated, and brutally efficient. He was known for his loyalty and his willingness to use violence without hesitation. He didn't just follow orders. He executed them with precision and made sure his superiors took notice. But the New York Mafia was entering a turbulent and deadly phase. A power struggle was brewing, and it would soon erupt into what became known as the Castellammarese War, a brutal conflict between the old guard led by Masuria and a rising faction led by Salvatore Maranzano. Genovese, ever the pragmatist, began to sense the tides were shifting. He joined forces with Charles "Lucky" Luciano, who envisioned a new, modern mafia, one built less on old Sicilian traditions and more on business-like efficiency. In 1931, this bloody war came to a dramatic end when Luciano orchestrated the murder of both Masuria and Maranzano, clearing the path for a new generation of leadership. Genovese played a critical role in these events, helping arrange Masuria's assassination in a staged betrayal that shocked the underworld. His actions earned him a position of immense trust and power within Luciano's newly formed crime empire. Now operating as Luciano's right-hand man, Vito Genovese helped restructure the Mafia's operations. He managed drug trafficking, gambling, and extortion rackets, building immense wealth and solidifying his position in the criminal hierarchy. He wasn't just a soldier anymore. He was a boss in the making. Feared by many, respected by even more, Genovese was now a force to be reckoned with inside the American Mafia. With the old Mafia leadership eliminated and a new generation in power, the underworld stood at a crossroads. The bloody infighting of the Castellammarese War had shown that chaos and unchecked ambition could easily tear the organization apart. Charles "Lucky" Luciano, now the most powerful mob boss in America, recognized the need for a structured, corporate-like approach to organized crime. And Vito Genovese, his trusted ally and top lieutenant, was right by his side as this vision took shape. In 1931, Luciano and his closest allies, including Genovese, helped establish what would become one of the most influential and secretive bodies in criminal history, the Commission. This ruling council would function like a board of directors for the Mafia, overseeing disputes, approving major decisions, and maintaining order between the five families of New York as well as other key Mafia organizations across the country. Genovese wasn't just a passive participant in the creation of this new system. He was instrumental in its design and enforcement. He understood that the Mafia could no longer afford the kind of senseless violence that had plagued the old world bosses. What they needed now was balance, an organized, structured entity that ensured profits were protected, territories respected, and betrayal dealt with swiftly and silently. The commission brought together the heads of the most powerful crime families, including the Luciano, later Genovese, Mangano, Bonanno, Prophesci, and Gagliano families. Each family had representation, and every major decision required a vote. Genovese, with his calculated demeanor and deep understanding of Mafia politics, became a key player in these meetings. He wasn't always in the spotlight, but behind closed doors, his voice carried weight. Through the commission, Genovese gained access to a national crime network that extended far beyond New York. He forged connections with mob bosses in Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, and even Havana. This system allowed for coordinated criminal enterprises, narcotics trafficking, gambling rings, labor racketeering, and more, all managed with the discipline of a multinational corporation. While Luciano was the public architect of the commission, Genovese ensured it functioned like a machine, precise, ruthless, and always focused on power and profit. It was a masterstroke in criminal governance, and it gave the Mafia a level of control and stability it had never known before. By the mid-1930s, Vito Genovese was riding high on power, wealth, and influence. As the underboss to Lucky Luciano, he wielded enormous control over the Mafia's operations in New York and beyond. But with power came visibility, and with visibility came risk. In 1937, that risk became real when Genovese found himself the prime suspect in a high-profile murder investigation. The victim was Ferdinand the Shadow Boccia, a minor mob associate who had crossed Genovese in a shady gambling scheme. After being double-crossed, Boccia made the fatal mistake of trying to fight back. According to later testimony, Genovese ordered his execution in cold blood. But before the authorities could bring him to trial, Genovese made a move that stunned even his criminal peers. He fled the United States and returned to his homeland of Italy. At first glance, his escape seemed like a desperate retreat. But Genovese had no intention of hiding in the shadows. Instead, he used his time in Italy to cultivate even more power and influence. He settled in the city of Nola, not far from his birthplace, and quickly began building ties with Italy's fascist elite. At the time, Benito Mussolini ruled the country with an iron fist, and Genovese, ever the opportunist, saw potential in aligning himself with the dictator's regime. He used his fortune to gain favor with local officials, bribing and manipulating his way into a position of comfort and control. It's widely believed that during this time, Genovese became involved in war profiteering and the black market, profiting off Italy's military campaigns and the suffering of the Italian people. He even forged ties with Italian-American expatriates and helped funnel information and resources back to his Mafia contacts in the U.S. But perhaps the most shocking episode during this period was Genovese's alleged role in the arrest and eventual murder of Carlo Tresca, an outspoken anti-fascist journalist who had openly criticized Mussolini and the Mafia alike. In 1943, while still in exile, Genovese reportedly used his influence to assist in targeting Tresca in New York through mob contacts, showing just how far his reach extended, even from across the Atlantic. In Italy, Genovese lived not as a fugitive but as a shadowy statesman, untouchable, connected, and still deeply involved in the affairs of organized crime. His years abroad were not a pause in his criminal life. They were a strategic interlude, a dark chapter in which he expanded his influence across continents, built ties with authoritarian powers, and ensured that his name remained feared on both sides of the Atlantic. As World War II reached its climax, Vito Genovese's carefully constructed world in Italy began to unravel. The fascist regime he had once courted was collapsing under the weight of Allied bombardment and civil unrest. With Mussolini overthrown and Nazi Germany retreating from Italian soil, the environment had become dangerous, not just for political leaders, but for anyone associated with the old power structures. Genovese, who had aligned himself with fascist authorities and enriched himself during the war, now faced a new threat: retribution and exposure. In 1944, the tides shifted again, this time in Genovese's favor. As U.S. forces advanced into Italy, he skillfully switched allegiances. Using his connections and knowledge of the region, Genovese began working with the U.S. military as an interpreter and translator. It was a masterstroke of manipulation. The same man who had built ties with Mussolini's regime now reinvented himself as a helpful collaborator to the Allies. To many, it was unthinkable. To Genovese, it was simply strategy. But his past caught up with him. American authorities eventually discovered his identity and arrested him on charges related to the 1934 murder of Ferdinand Boccia. He was brought back to the United States in 1945 under armed escort, facing what seemed like a long overdue reckoning. Yet, in a move that shocked many, Genovese escaped conviction once again. The government's star witness, Ernest "the Hawk" Ruppolo, was murdered before he could testify. With the key testimony gone, the charges were dropped. Genovese was free. What followed was one of the most remarkable comebacks in the history of organized crime. Far from being weakened by his years in exile, Genovese returned to a mafia world in transition, and he was determined to dominate it. Though others had filled the power vacuum during his absence, Genovese began quietly rebuilding his network. He reclaimed control over his old rackets and strengthened ties with allies across the five families. Unlike the flashier mobsters of the day, Genovese operated with patience and precision. He played the long game, outmaneuvering rivals and placing loyal men in key positions. His ambition was as fierce as ever. Genovese no longer wanted to be just an underboss or trusted advisor. He wanted to be the boss. To do that, he had to unseat Frank Costello, who had risen to lead the family during Genovese's time abroad. In public, Genovese remained calm and composed. But behind the scenes, he orchestrated a silent campaign of pressure, intimidation, and political maneuvering, slowly turning the tide in his favor. He also expanded his criminal empire, strengthening narcotics trafficking operations, gambling rings, and labor racketeering deals. His international connections, forged during the war years, gave him a significant advantage. Genovese understood the global nature of crime, and he leveraged every relationship, every dollar, and every opportunity to tighten his grip on the underworld. By the late 1940s, Vito Genovese had re-established himself as a central figure in the American Mafia. But he wasn't finished. To him, rebuilding was only the beginning. The real prize, ultimate control over the most powerful crime family in America, still lay ahead. By the early 1950s, Vito Genovese had rebuilt his criminal empire with ruthless focus and deliberate patience. But despite his growing influence, one obstacle still stood in the way of his ultimate ambition: Frank Costello. Known as the Prime Minister of the Underworld, Costello had stepped into power during Genovese's exile and had since become one of the most politically connected mafia bosses in American history. He cultivated relationships with judges, politicians, and businessmen, projecting an image of a refined, almost aristocratic gangster who preferred influence over violence. To Genovese, that wasn't the mafia he envisioned. He saw Costello's style as weak, too cozy with the establishment, too soft on enemies. Genovese wanted to return the mafia to its roots: ruthless, feared, and unyielding. He didn't just want Costello's seat at the top, he believed he deserved it. And so began one of the most cunning and dangerous internal power plays in the history of the American Mafia. Genovese didn't openly challenge Costello. Instead, he launched a quiet war, turning allies, sowing distrust, and strategically undermining Costello's support base within the family. He portrayed himself as the stronger, more traditional leader, one who wouldn't compromise the family's power for the sake of diplomacy. Slowly, many of the soldiers and capos within the Luciano family, soon to bear Genovese's name, began shifting their loyalty toward him. But words and politics could only go so far. Genovese understood that in the world of organized crime, true change often came through blood. On May 2, 1957, that moment arrived. As Frank Costello entered the lobby of his Manhattan apartment building, a gunman stepped out of the shadows and fired. Costello was struck in the head, but miraculously, he survived. The shooter fled the scene, but the message was clear. Genovese had made his move. Though he lived, Costello got the message loud and clear. In the days that followed, he quietly stepped down from power, choosing self-preservation over continued warfare. With no trial, no ceremony, and no headlines, a silent coup had occurred. Genovese had won. He immediately took control of the family, renaming it after himself. A bold move that cemented his legacy and sent a signal to the rest of the underworld. A new era had begun. Under his leadership, the Genovese family became even more secretive, structured, and disciplined. He enforced a rigid chain of command and centralized operations, making the family the most powerful and tightly controlled mafia organization in the country. Genovese also ramped up narcotics trafficking, a highly lucrative but risky venture that other bosses were reluctant to touch. He didn't care. For him, the rewards outweighed the risks. Money poured in, and his influence extended not only across New York but into Cuba, South America, and parts of Europe. Though feared and often despised, Vito Genovese had achieved what few had ever done. He had taken the reins of America's most powerful crime family through strategy, violence, and sheer force of will. Now, with his name etched into the very organization he ruled, Genovese sat at the pinnacle of organized crime. By 1957, Vito Genovese had risen to what many believed was the peak of mafia power in America. He was no longer just a shadowy underworld figure. He was the boss of bosses in the eyes of many. But Genovese was not content with running just the Genovese family. He wanted something bigger, full control over the entire national mafia structure. To do that, he needed recognition, consolidation, and, most importantly, the appearance of unity. So he did what no mafia boss had dared to do on such a scale. He called a nationwide summit. The location was Apalachin, New York, a quiet, wooded town far from the eyes of law enforcement, or so it seemed. On November 14, 1957, more than 100 top mafia figures from across the United States and abroad converged on the rural estate of Joseph Barbara, a known associate of the Mafia, in upstate New York. They arrived in flashy cars, wearing expensive suits, some with their families or bodyguards in tow. The guest list included bosses from New York, Chicago, Buffalo, Los Angeles, Cleveland, and even Sicily. Men who controlled billions of dollars in rackets, drugs, unions, and casinos. Genovese had orchestrated the meeting with one goal in mind: to officially crown himself the most powerful and central figure in the American Mafia. He wanted to demonstrate that the old order was gone and that his leadership would bring discipline, expansion, and renewed strength to La Cosa Nostra. There were reports that major topics discussed included the division of territories, narcotics trafficking, control over Cuban casinos, and the approval of new bosses and lieutenants across families. In Genovese's eyes, this meeting was a coronation, one that would solidify his place as the supreme architect of the American underworld. But what was meant to be a private gathering of power turned into one of the biggest disasters in mafia history. Local law enforcement, already suspicious of Barbara's property due to its frequent high-profile visitors, noticed the sudden influx of out-of-state license plates and luxury vehicles. Acting on a tip, New York State Police raided the estate. In a matter of minutes, the peaceful countryside exploded into chaos. Mafia bosses were seen sprinting into the woods, diving into ditches, and even hiding in dog kennels in an attempt to escape arrest. Dozens were caught, questioned, and identified. The police compiled names, photographs, and organizational ties that would later serve as a blueprint for federal investigations. Though many of the men were released for lack of evidence, the very fact that they had gathered in such a coordinated way confirmed what law enforcement had long suspected but could never prove: that a nationwide mafia network did exist. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic for the Mafia and especially for Genovese. The Apalachin Meeting shattered the Mafia's long-cherished illusion of secrecy. Newspapers ran front-page stories, showing mugshots of gangsters once believed to be untouchable. The FBI, which had previously downplayed the existence of organized crime at this scale, was forced to admit that a sophisticated, hierarchical criminal network spanned the entire country. In response, J. Edgar Hoover ramped up federal investigations, creating dedicated mafia task forces and surveillance programs. The era of unchecked mafia power was over. And while Genovese had hoped the meeting would crown him king, it instead painted a massive target on his back. Rivals within the commission began questioning his judgment. Many blamed him for the increased heat from law enforcement. Whispers of betrayal and revenge began to circulate. The very gathering meant to unify the mafia had fractured it, and Genovese's once unchallenged position began to tremble beneath his feet. After the disastrous fallout of the Apalachin Meeting in 1957, Vito Genovese's empire, once feared, respected, and far-reaching, began to show cracks. What was supposed to be his moment of triumph became the very event that exposed the mafia's inner workings to the world and brought relentless attention from law enforcement agencies, particularly the newly invigorated FBI. Genovese had overreached, and now the predators of the legal system were circling. Among those watching him closely were not just federal agents, but also his own allies and enemies within the mafia. Many believed that Genovese's ambition had brought too much heat on the organization. Rivals saw an opportunity to bring him down and reclaim influence. Rumors swirled that his own underworld peers, tired of his arrogance and fearful of more public exposure, conspired to remove him, not with bullets, but with something far more damning: the justice system. In 1959, just 2 years after the Apalachin fiasco, Genovese was indicted on federal narcotics charges. The government alleged that he was the mastermind behind a vast heroin trafficking ring, one that funneled drugs from Europe through Cuba and into major American cities. The case relied heavily on informants, including a drug dealer named Nelson Cantelops, whose testimony linked Genovese directly to international drug operations. Though Genovese had always maintained that he steered clear of direct narcotics involvement, a claim many mob bosses made to avoid the long prison sentences associated with drug charges, the evidence and testimony were enough. Many within law enforcement believed the case was helped along by those within the mafia itself who wanted Genovese out of the picture permanently. Whether through betrayal or legitimate evidence, the trial ended in conviction. In April 1959, Vito Genovese was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. He was sent to the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, where he would spend the remainder of his life. But even behind bars, Genovese refused to relinquish control. He continued to run the Genovese family from his prison cell, issuing orders through trusted lieutenants and visitors. He held meetings with other imprisoned mobsters and remained a feared and respected figure. His ability to project power, even from confinement, was a testament to the strength of the organization he had built. However, the walls were closing in. The world outside was changing. Law enforcement was growing smarter, surveillance more invasive, and the mafia's once sacred code of silence was starting to erode as more insiders turned informant. Within prison, Genovese's health began to decline. He suffered from heart problems and grew increasingly paranoid, convinced that even behind bars, enemies within his own family were working to poison or sideline him. Power, which had once come so naturally, was now slipping through his fingers. Despite his imprisonment and declining health, Vito Genovese remained a symbol of power and ruthlessness in the mafia world until his death in 1969. His life was a testament to ambition, cunning, and the brutal realities of organized crime. Genovese's legacy is a complex one, marked by both the heights of criminal empire building and the inevitable downfall that follows unchecked greed and violence. In the annals of mafia history, his name endures as a reminder of how far one man can rise, and how quickly it can all come crashing down.